Welcome back. I was reviewing a script this week, a rebirth narrative about a woman forced to deliver a bridesmaid speech she originally wrote for herself. The cold detail is this: she didn't change a single word of it. Not one. She delivered it exactly as written and let the room do the rest. You're watching Historical Manhwa. The first thing Mara Cole noticed when she woke up was the smell. Cheap instant coffee. The kind that came in silver packets with the powder already crystallized at the edges. The smell of it had always been specific to one place, the shared kitchen at Alder and Finch Capital Management, specifically the third-floor break room with the flickering fluorescent tube above the microwave that maintenance had been promising to fix since February. She could hear it now, that faint electrical stutter. Tick, 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 like a metronome counting down to something no one else in the building seemed to notice. She was lying on the narrow couch in her office, not the bedroom of the house she'd been renting since Damien left, not the hospital room where she had last been conscious, with the antiseptic smell and the beeping machines and the particular quality of silence that told you the people outside the door were waiting for permission to cry. She was on her office couch, the one with the scratchy gray upholstery she'd been meaning to replace for 2 years, and she was wearing the ivory blouse and slate blue pencil skirt she recognized as her Thursday outfit, the outfit she wore to the Thursday board presentations because it read as authoritative without trying too hard. She sat up slowly. The desktop calendar on her credenza read March 4th. Mara stared at it for a long time. In the life she was leaving, the one that had ended at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in November, when a Holt Meridian Company vehicle ran a red light on Calder Avenue and struck her driver's side door with enough force to push her car through a guardrail. It had been November. Late November. The smell of that month was different: brown leaves and radiator heat and the particular staleness of grief that had no outlet. She pressed her palm flat against the desk surface. Cold laminate, real. March 4th. She counted backward with the precision of a woman who had built her career on forensic accounting, on following the numerical truth of things through columns and ledgers and balance sheets that companies hoped no one would ever read carefully. March 4th was 8 months and 12 days before the wedding. 8 months and 12 days before Serena Voss stood at the altar of the Whitmore Hotel ballroom in a dress that had cost $43,000 and smiled at Damien Holt like she had invented him, while Mara stood 6 feet to her left in a dusty rose bridesmaid gown she had been given 48 hours notice to purchase. 8 months and 12 days before she had been handed a typed index card and told, in Serena's particular brand of sweetness that always had an edge to it, that the maid of honor had come down with laryngitis, and could Mara please read the speech she'd prepared. It was already on the card, and it would mean so much. Mara had read the speech. She'd read every word of it. She had not known in that first life that the speech on that index card was the one she herself had written 18 months earlier. Not for Serena's wedding, but for her own. A document she had kept on her personal laptop under the folder title Archive. One of 40 or 50 half-written things she kept the way some people kept old photographs. She'd written it during a sleepless night when she was 3 months into her relationship with Damien and had been, God help her, completely certain about him. The speech had been addressed to an unnamed future maid of honor. It told the story of how Damien had found her crying in the Alder and Finch parking garage at 2 a.m. because a client presentation had collapsed, and how he had sat on the concrete with her without asking a single question, and how she had thought that was the most significant thing a person had ever done for her. It told the story of their first trip to the coast, the specific gray of that ocean, the hotel with the peeling wallpaper that they'd laughed about. It described his hands. She had read every word of it aloud in front of 240 guests, in a dusty rose gown she'd paid $400 for on 2 days' notice, while Serena watched from the altar with her $43,000 smile, and Damien stood beside her with his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above Mara's left shoulder, and the room had gone very, very quiet, in a way that was not the quiet of sentimentality, but the quiet of dawning comprehension. So 240 people had understood, in that moment, that something was wrong. No one had said so. The reception had continued. The champagne had flowed. Mara had spent the rest of the evening in the women's restroom on the 2nd floor, sitting on the tile floor with her back against the wall of a stall, and no one had come to check on her because no one had known what to say, and also because some of them had already started to talk. She had left before the cake was cut. In the months after, she'd learned what she hadn't known during those 3 years with Damien, The forensic details, as she thought of them now. The way the affair with Serena had begun roughly 14 months before the wedding, which put it at month 10 of Mara and Damien's relationship. The way Serena had slowly, methodically created a parallel proximity to Damien by inventing reasons to include him in things, by volunteering her apartment as a neutral meeting space. By being available in all the ways that a woman who wanted something was available. Mara had been working 80-hour weeks during that period. She was building the forensic analysis practice at Alder and Finch from essentially nothing, converting a junior audit team into something that could handle SEC referrals and shareholder litigation support, and she had been deeply, completely absorbed in it. She had also, in months 7 through 12 of her relationship with Damien, been working with him professionally. Damien Holt ran Holt Meridian, a mid-sized investment group that had brought Alder and Finch in to resolve a compliance issue related to a series of fund transfers that hadn't been properly disclosed. It was Mara's case. She had spent 6 months inside his company's financial infrastructure, pulling transaction histories, cross-referencing fund flows, and building what became a clean and defensible compliance correction that kept Holt Meridian out of an SEC inquiry. She had also, in those 6 months, given Damien Holt an education in exactly how money was hidden, moved, and ultimately exposed. She had not known in that first life what he'd done with that education. She knew now the Calder Avenue accident that had killed her, the one she had at first categorized as a tragic coincidence, a terrible thing with no author, had not been random. The investigation had stalled. The driver of the Holt Meridian vehicle had been placed on administrative leave and then quietly transferred to a division in another city. The police report had cited a yellow to red traffic signal, driver error, poor visibility due to road conditions. Case closed, pending insurance settlement. But Mara, even in the final weeks of her life, had been working on something. A second analysis, a private one done from home on her personal laptop, to tracing a pattern she'd noticed in the Alder and Finch client files, a pattern that pointed to Holt Meridian that suggested the compliance correction she'd designed had been subsequently reverse-engineered and used as a blueprint for something much more sophisticated than what she'd originally been hired to fix. She had been getting close. And then she'd been struck by a company vehicle at 11:47 p.m. on a Calder Avenue. She had no reason to be driving down except that she'd received a text from an unknown number about a document drop at a parking structure 2 blocks away. A text she'd now had 8 months and 12 days to think about, and her conclusion was not a complicated one. She sat in her office chair on March 4th and breathed in the smell of cheap, crystallized coffee and the ticking of the fluorescent light. And she thought about all of this with the particular coolness of a person who has already died once and does not intend to do it again. She pulled her laptop open. The first thing she did was not dramatic. It was not a confrontation or a declaration or a strategic speech. It was what any forensic accountant worth the letters after her name would do first, which was to take inventory. She opened a blank document and she began to write down everything she knew. Every transaction anomaly she'd cataloged in those last months of her life, every name, every fund designation, every date. She wrote for 4 hours without stopping until the fluorescent light above the third-floor microwave stopped ticking and the early commuters started arriving downstairs. And by the time she was done, she had 14 pages of structured notes that told a story Holt Meridian's lawyers were not going to enjoy. She saved the document to an encrypted external drive she bought that afternoon at a hardware store 3 blocks from the office. Cash purchase. She wore sunglasses inside the store, which she acknowledged to herself was theatrical, but she was not in a position to dismiss theatrical precautions anymore. Then she began. The thing about forensic accounting as a discipline, and Mara had tried to explain this to people at dinner parties and networking events, and had watched their eyes glaze over, which was fine, it worked in her favor, was that it was not about numbers. Numbers were just the surface. Forensic accounting was about behavior. It was about the specific fingerprinted way that human beings moved money when they were trying not to be seen moving money. And that behavior was as distinctive and as readable as a person's handwriting once you understood its grammar. Damien Holt had learned her grammar, but he'd learned it as a student, which meant he understood the principles without understanding the depth. He knew how to structure a fund transfer to avoid triggering standard AML flags. He knew how to use layered shell company intermediaries to separate the origin of funds from their destination. He knew, from watching her work, That the most dangerous financial forensics analysts were the ones who didn't just look at transaction records, but at the timing relationships between transactions, the gaps and compressions that indicated someone trying to manage visibility. What he didn't know was what Mara had learned in the 2 years after she finished his compliance case, working on 3 separate SEC referrals that had each, in their own way, been more sophisticated than anything in his repertoire. He had learned her grammar as of 4 years ago. She had not stopped developing it. The Holt Meridian structure, as she'd been piecing it together in the final months of her first life, was not simple, but it had a specific weakness. The layered shell companies were registered across 4 jurisdictions: Delaware, Cayman Islands, Singapore, and one she'd only recently identified, a less commonly used structure through a Maltese holding company that had been set up in a name she recognized. The name was Serena Voss's mother's maiden name. She had thought when she first found that she was seeing a coincidence. She had even said that to herself. Coincidence. The name was not uncommon. There were other Hartfield holdings in the world. She did not think that anymore. She contacted on March 6th a securities attorney named Owen Park, who worked out of a small office in the financial district, and who had been her adversary on exactly 2 cases, and her quiet collaborator on 1. And who she trusted in the specific way you trusted someone who had seen you be rigorous under pressure and respected it without comment. She called him on a personal cell phone from a coffee shop 3 blocks from her office, not her regular coffee shop, the one closer to the building, and told him she needed a confidential consultation on a whistleblower matter. He said he could see her the following Tuesday. She said she would bring documents. He paused and said, "How many documents?" She said, "I'm still compiling, but you should set aside 3 hours. Another pause. "All right, Mara." She brought him 5 hours of material. Owen Park had the quality that good lawyers had when confronted with genuinely interesting information, which was a particular stillness, like a person choosing not to move so they didn't disturb the thing they were looking at. He sat across from her in the small conference room with its view of a parking structure and its yellowing blinds and its slightly sticky table surface, and he read through what she'd built with the focus of someone who was performing multiple simultaneous calculations. And at the end, he looked up and said, "You've been sitting on this for how long?" "I've been building it," she said, "for 8 months. Before you came to me, I wanted it to be clean." He looked back down at the documents. "So when do you anticipate having the complete structure mapped?" 6 weeks, she said. "Maybe 8. "And you have access to the source transactions?" "I still have my work files from the original compliance engagement. Those are legitimately mine. They were retained under Alder and Finch's client file protocols. And I was the supervising analyst. I have the right to access those for ongoing quality review under our engagement contract. That gives me the documented foundation." She paused. "The additional material I've sourced through public filings, registrar searches, and FOIA requests, everything I've done is documented and defensible." He looked at her over his reading glasses. "Has anyone at Holt Meridian been in contact with you recently?" "No." "Are you still in contact with Damien Holt personally?" "We ended our relationship 14 months ago." She said it evenly. "I haven't spoken to him since." Owen Park did not ask her how she felt about that. This was one of the things she valued about him. "You understand that once I file this, it becomes a process with its own momentum," he said. "The SEC whistleblower office is thorough, but they're not fast. And there will be a period between filing and action where you are technically exposed." "I understand." "And the Maltese structure, you have a high degree of confidence in the Hartfield connection." "I have 3 independent data points linking that entity to the Voss family, and one that I'm still verifying. When I have all 4, yes, high confidence." He nodded slowly, tapping his pen against the edge of the documents. "I want to be careful about the personal dimension here. Oh, if this is partly a..." "It's not," she said. "I mean that professionally, not defensively. The financial harm documented in these filings affects Alder and Finch clients whose funds were managed, in part, through instruments that touched these structures. 2 of those clients are now under SEC investigation for discrepancies they didn't cause. This is not personal, Owen. This is the thing that the SEC whistleblower provision was designed for." He studied her face for a moment, and she met his gaze without expression, and then he said, "All right," and picked up a pen. Serena Voss had been Mara's closest friend for 9 years. This was the piece of the story that Mara had spent a great deal of the past 8 months. The previous months, the months that had not happened yet in this timeline, the months of her first life that she was now trying to think of as research materials, examining from the angle of an analyst rather than a grieving former friend. When you stripped the warmth out of it and looked at it structurally, the friendship had always had a particular architecture. Serena was charming in the way that people who had been trained from childhood to manage other people's perceptions were charming. She was thoughtful in ways that made you feel seen, and she had an exquisite sense for exactly how much vulnerability to offer in exchange for your own. She made you feel like her confidences were rare and precious, which made you offer yours more freely. Mara had been offering hers for 9 years. She thought about the conversation, March of their second year as friends, where she told Serena about her mother's estate situation, the complicated mess that had resulted from her father's early death, and a will that hadn't been updated, and how she'd spent her first 2 years out of graduate school helping her mother navigate the legal challenge to a property that should have transferred cleanly. She had told Serena this as an explanation for why she'd gone into forensic accounting rather than private equity, which paid better. She'd wanted to understand how money moved in institutional structures, she'd said. She'd wanted to understand the language of financial truth-telling. She had meant it. She thought about Serena listening to that conversation and wondered now what she'd been calculating behind those attentive eyes. She thought about all the times over 9 years that she'd described her work to Serena. Not specifics, never client names, but the shape of cases, the types of structures she was analyzing, the methodologies she was developing. She thought about the dinner party 18 months into her relationship with Damien, where all 3 of them had been in the same room for what she'd understood at the time as the first time, though she now knew it was not. She thought about the way Serena had steered that dinner party conversation with her particular social fluency toward Mara's work and then toward Damien's business, and then had stepped back like a director satisfied with the blocking and let them discover, apparently organically, that they had professional common ground. She thought about how Damien had contacted her office 6 weeks later about the compliance engagement. She had thought that was a professional contact. She had thought the dinner party connection was background context, not a mechanism. She reflected now, not quite as naturally suspicious as her profession required. She was correcting that. In April, 7 months before the wedding, she attended Serena's engagement party at the Aldgate Club. A rooftop event with the early spring wind cutting through the decorative market lights and the catering staff in pressed white jackets carrying trays of champagne coupes that kept nearly tipping in the gusts. Mara wore a green dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion. She'd had her hair done. She had arrived 15 minutes early and positioned herself near the door, which gave her a natural reason to speak to each arriving guest without appearing to be working the room. She was, in fact, working the room. She had spent the preceding 3 weeks identifying the key guests on the invite list. Not the social ones, not Damien's college friends, or Serena's industry contacts from the PR firm where she worked. The structural ones, the investors in Holt Meridian's current fund, 2 of whom were personal social connections of Damien's father. The family attorney, a quiet man named Bernard Chu, who had handled the Holt family estate for 30 years, and who, she had reason to believe, had been kept carefully uninformed about the shape of the newer financial structures. And one particular person, a woman named Priya Anand, who was an associate at the SEC's New York regional office and who was attending as a personal guest of one of the partners at Serena's PR firm. Mara had not engineered Priya Anand's presence at the party. She had, however, known she would be there, because the PR firm partner's Instagram had posted a pre-party dinner photo the night before that included Priya. Social media was a gift when you knew how to use it. She did not approach Priya Anand directly. She didn't need to. She introduced herself to the PR firm partner, made conversation for 12 minutes about a mutual professional contact, and allowed herself to be introduced to the partner's dinner group, which included Priya. They spoke for perhaps 6 minutes. Mara mentioned she worked in forensic accounting. Priya mentioned her work at the SEC without specificity. They exchanged business cards in the professional, automatic way of people at an industry-adjacent party, and then the conversation expanded to include others and moved on. That was all. It was enough. She had placed her card in the specific ecosystem of the SEC's New York office. She had established a face and a name and a professional context. When Owen Park filed the whistleblower complaint in 6 weeks, and the name Mara Cole appeared in the documentation, there would be at least one person in that office who would have a small, clear memory of a woman in a green dress at an April party who had made a very specific and competent impression. She drank 2 glasses of champagne over the course of the evening and ate a small plate of the past hors d'oeuvres that were better than you expected at these things. She spoke to Damien once. Oh, briefly, near the bar. He was polite in the careful way of a person managing a situation, and she was polite in return. And she congratulated him with a warmth that was not performed because she had, in fact, spent the last 8 months practicing the management of the internal temperature of conversations, knowing exactly how warm to be and why. "It's good to see you," he said. "You too," she said. "She looks very happy." He glanced towards Serena across the room. He knew he was holding court near the market lights with the ease of a person who had been planning this moment for a long time. "She does." "I'm glad," Mara said. He looked at her then, briefly, with something she couldn't quite classify. Uncertainty, maybe, or the low-grade guilt of a person who had convinced themselves they didn't have enough to feel guilty about. Then someone called his name from across the room, and he excused himself, and she watched him go and thought, 8 months. The whistleblower filing happened on a Thursday in May, and it was anticlimactic in the way that the most consequential professional actions were anticlimactic. A document filed electronically through the SEC's secure portal, acknowledged with an automated receipt, assigned a case number that meant nothing yet, but would mean a great deal later. Owen Park sent her a text that said simply, "Filed and documented," and she replied, "Thank you," and then she sat in her office and looked out the window at the particular gray of the city in May, the way the overcast light made every building's surface the same flat color, and she felt the specific calm of having done the irreversible thing. There was no celebration. That was not what this was. She went home that evening and made rice and a simple broth and sat at her kitchen table and thought through the timeline. The SEC process was not fast. Owen had been honest about that. A matter of this complexity, multiple jurisdictions, layered corporate structures, the international dimension of the Maltese holding company, would take time to investigate properly. It would not resolve before the wedding. It might not resolve for a year or more after the wedding. That was fine. The wedding was not the primary event. The wedding was one event in a sequence, and her presence in it was strategic rather than social. She had already decided to remain in the bridesmaid role. She had not been asked yet. In this timeline, that invitation would come in late May. But she would accept it. She would be present. She would be positioned exactly where she needed to be. She had one additional asset to deploy that was completely separate from the SEC filing, and it required her to be standing at that altar. The speech. In June, Serena called her on a Sunday afternoon to ask her officially to be in the wedding party. The call had the specific texture of a Serena performance. Warm without being saccharine, intimate without being presumptuous, framed so that Mara felt she was being offered something precious rather than asked to perform a service. "I can't imagine it without you," Serena said. "You've been there for all of it." For everything? For all of it, Mara thought. Yes. "I'd be honored," she said. They talked for 20 minutes about the logistics, the dress, dusty rose, a designer she vaguely knew, the price point that would require a minor recalibration of her discretionary spending that month, the venue, the Whitmore Hotel's ballroom, which Mara already knew because she had done her reconnaissance, the rehearsal dinner, Friday before the wedding, at a restaurant downtown Mara also already knew. Serena asked if she'd be willing to contribute to a toast if needed. She said the maid of honor, a woman named Dana Cho from Serena's college years, had already written a speech, but if anything happened, it would be good to have a backup. Mara said, of course. She sat with the phone in her hand after the call ended and looked at the wall. The speech. She had written it in what she still thought of as her real life, the life before Damien, before any of this. When she was 3 months into a relationship with someone she had believed completely. She had written it late at night, not drunk, but in that slightly unguarded state of tiredness that let honest things come through. It was not a sentimental speech. Exactly. It read more like a piece of literary nonfiction, specific, observational, without the standard wedding speech scaffolding of inside jokes and general declarations of affection. It had been addressed to a future maid of honor who would stand where she was standing, and it told stories. Real stories. The parking garage at 2 a.m., the coast trip, and the peeling wallpaper hotel. A Sunday morning in February when she'd been sick with the kind of flu that makes you feel briefly philosophical, and he had spent 4 hours on the couch with her watching a documentary series about migratory birds without once suggesting they watch something else. The speech described his hands in the way that you described a thing when you had no intention of anyone else ever reading it. She still had the document. She'd found it, in this new timeline, in exactly the folder she remembered. Archive, on her personal laptop, between a half-finished short story she'd started in 2019 and a folder of photographs from a trip she'd taken alone to Portugal. She read it twice in late June, sitting in her apartment in the particular thick heat of that month with the window unit running and the light coming in slant through the blinds. It was a good speech. Every story in it was true. Every story in it was about her and Damien. She saved a copy to the encrypted drive. She did not make any changes. The months between May and November had a quality she thought of as controlled velocity, the sense of moving fast while appearing still. She met the other bridesmaids at the dress fitting in July. 2 women from Serena's PR firm world who were pleasant and uninteresting, a childhood friend named Haley who had the particular exhaustion of someone performing a role she hadn't entirely chosen. Dana Cho, the maid of honor, was efficient and warm and had the mildly frantic quality of someone managing a large project they'd underestimated. She liked Dana Cho. It was genuinely unfortunate that Dana was going to develop laryngitis. She did not know yet exactly how that was going to happen. In her first life, it had appeared to be a genuine illness, viral, she'd assumed, the kind of throat infection that chose its timing with perfect cruelty. She now suspected it had been engineered, not dramatically engineered, not something out of a thriller, but the ordinary human kind. Serena would find a way to expose Dana to someone with a throat infection in the days before the wedding. Would ensure Dana spent that pre-wedding Thursday evening in a cold restaurant with inadequate ventilation, or at an event where she was doing a lot of talking in a noisy room. The kind of thing that no one would ever be able to prove was deliberate, because it probably wasn't. Quite. Or because Serena would not be able to prove it to herself, which was its own category of plausible deniability. The end result would be the same. Dana would lose her voice. Mara would be handed an index card. She had already decided what she was going to do with that index card. In September, Owen Park called her to update her on the SEC process. The complaint had been accepted for investigation. The case had been assigned to a team in the enforcement division. He said, carefully, that he had been told by a contact that the matter was being treated as priority given the scale of the fund structures involved. He said she should be prepared for a process that might generate attention, and that she should consult with him before making any public statements. She said she understood. She asked him to estimate a timeline. He said that he expected some form of preliminary action before the end of the first quarter of the following year, possibly sooner if the examination of the Maltese structure moved quickly. She did the arithmetic. First quarter of the following year began in January. The wedding was in November. There would be a window of 2 to 4 months between the wedding and any formal SEC action, and in that window, Damien would still have access to his full range of resources and legal options. This was relevant. This was why the speech mattered in a way that went beyond the personal dimension of it, which she was not denying existed. The speech was not the weapon. The speech was the confirmation. She needed the room to know before anything else happened. What the room would not know from the SEC process, that Serena Voss had been part of this from the beginning. The SEC filing documented financial crimes. It named Damien as the primary architect. It identified the Hartfield holding structure and its connection to the Voss family. But financial crimes were abstract things, presented through the dense grammar of regulatory filings and legal language. They were real, and they were serious, and they would ultimately be consequential. But they would arrive in the world with lawyers buffering them and statements being crafted and careful narrative management by people who were very good at that. The speech would arrive in the world with no buffering at all. 240 guests, most of whom were Damien's investors, his father's connections, his family's social world, would hear a woman in a dusty rose dress deliver, in a voice they would have to assume was Dana Cho's. Since they would have been told it was Dana Cho's, a speech that contained specific, precise, recognizable stories about someone other than the bride and the groom's relationship, about the groom's previous relationship, about the groom and his forensic accountant ex-girlfriend who had spent 6 months inside his company's financial systems. The room would not be able to unhear that, and Mara would be standing there when it landed. She would be able to watch, from 6 feet away, the specific moment when Damien Holt and Serena Voss understood that the speech on the index card was not Dana Cho's speech. She wants to describe the October bridesmaid luncheon because it had a detail she needed to remember clearly. It was held at a private room in a French restaurant in the meatpacking district, the kind of place with bread service that involved actual butter on actual cloth and lighting warm enough to make everyone look like their best self. Serena was radiant in the specific way she became radiant when she was the center of a room that was entirely organized around her. She worked the table with attention and humor and the practiced intimacy of a woman who had been good at managing rooms for a long time. Halfway through the main course, Dana Cho mentioned her speech. "I've been working on it for 3 months, she said. "I read it to my husband, and he cried," which I told him means nothing because he cries at insurance commercials. "Oh, but I'm still counting it." Serena laughed her genuine laugh, the one that was almost unguarded, quick and slightly higher than her social laugh. "I'm sure it's incredible." "I'm nervous about it," Dana said. "I'm a terrible public speaker under normal circumstances. I'm going to be one of those people who has to breathe deeply between every sentence." "You'll be fine," Serena said, and reached across to touch Dana's hand. "You are going to be so wonderful." Mara, seated 3 seats to Serena's left, ate her sole meuniere and thought about timing. She thought about this. Serena had just, in this brief exchange, confirmed that she intended Dana's speech to be delivered, which meant that the substitution, the index card, the forced handoff, had not been decided yet. Or it had been decided, and Serena was performing normalcy around it. Either way, the mechanism wasn't yet locked in. The mechanism was going to be the illness. Mara had spent some time thinking about whether to prevent the illness. She had access, if she thought creatively, to ways of doing that. Warning Dana, finding a way to ensure she avoided whatever exposure Serena had planned. But preventing the illness would prevent the speech, and the speech was the hinge. She let it go. Dana Cho was going to lose her voice. Mara was going to deliver the speech. It was going to be the speech she'd written 3 years ago, word for word. Only in the voice of a woman who had been completely certain about someone who had then demonstrated that certainty was not the same thing as accuracy. It was going to be devastating. She ordered the tarte tatin and made pleasant conversation about the color of the reception flowers, which she understood were a point of some tension between Serena and the hotel's events coordinator. And she nodded at the right moments with the focused attention of a woman who had nothing more pressing on her mind. So she spent the 2 weeks before the wedding in a state she recognized as the calm, before not a storm, but a detonation. Something that would not be weather but architecture, a thing that had been built deliberately and would come apart in a specific sequence. She filed 2 additional documents with Owen Park in that period. One was a supplementary memo documenting 3 more transaction chains she'd verified through late-stage research. Chains that connected the Holt Meridian fund structures to specific Alder and Finch client accounts that had experienced unexplained underperformance in 2 consecutive quarters. The second was a detailed accounting of what she believed to be the full scope of the Hartfield Holdings structure, including the 4th data point she'd been missing, a company registration document from the Maltese Financial Services Authority that she'd obtained through a records request that had taken 11 weeks to process. The 4th data point was clean. Serena Voss's mother, Gloria Voss, née Hartfield, was listed as a beneficial owner of Hartfield Holdings, Malta Limited, home with a registered address that matched the family home in Connecticut that Mara had been to 40 or 50 times over 9 years of friendship. Owen Park called her the morning after she filed the supplementary memo. He said, "The 4th data point." "Yes. This changes the personal exposure profile significantly." "I know." "Serena Voss is potentially a co-respondent." "I know." A pause. "Are you still attending the wedding?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment in the way that lawyers were quiet when they were deciding how much to say. Then, "I want you to understand that from a legal strategy standpoint, there is no direct benefit to your attendance at the wedding. The SEC process is independent of any social actions you take." "I understand that." "And from a personal risk standpoint," "Owen," she said, "I understand." Another pause. All right. I'm going to be careful." "I know you are." He said it with a weight that suggested he was not entirely reassured, but understood that the matter was decided. "Call me the Monday after." "I will." The rehearsal dinner was held on the Friday evening at a restaurant called Fincham in the West Village. Low ceilings, good wine program, the kind of place where the tables were close enough together that you were perpetually aware of the conversations around you. Mara arrived at 7, 5 minutes before the reservation, and took her seat in the arranged configuration. Wedding party at the long center table, family and close friends at surrounding foretops. She was placed between Haley, the childhood friend bridesmaid, and one of the PR firm bridesmaids whose name was Camille, and who had a way of talking that was fast and cheerful and required very little input from her conversation partner, which was useful. She ate her dinner and spoke pleasantly to Camille about the seating chart and the hotel and the flowers, which had been resolved in favor of ivory ranunculus with some eucalyptus, and she watched Dana Cho across the table, who was drinking herbal tea instead of wine and occasionally pressing a hand to her throat with the particular self-consciousness of someone who has already identified the symptom and is trying not to catastrophize it. Mara noted the herbal tea. She noted it as a data point, confirming that the mechanism was in motion. Dana was already feeling the beginning of the illness, which meant the exposure had happened in the last 24 to 48 hours. Serena, seated at the head of the table beside Damien, was currently occupied with a story that was making the adjacent foretop guests laugh, and her back was 3/4 turned to Dana, which was either natural or practiced. Mara ate her sea bass and thought about the speech. She had read it one more time that morning, in the gray 6 a.m. light of her apartment before she'd fully gotten up. She had read it without the analytical distance she'd been maintaining for months. She had let it be what it was. A document written by a younger version of herself, a woman who had not been wrong about the quality of a feeling even if she had been wrong about its durability. The parking garage story was true. The coast trip was true. The Sunday with the Migratory Birds documentary was true. These things had happened. The fact that they had been used did not make them false. The room was going to understand that they were true. That was the specific nature of what was going to happen at that altar tomorrow. After dinner, Damien gave a brief toast. Warm, articulate, the practiced ease of a man who had been in front of rooms his whole life. He said things about Serena that were genuinely charming. And Mara watched him from her seat and thought about the Calder Avenue night, and did not feel the thing she had spent many months of her first life feeling, which was a particular heavy sadness that was more about the loss of the possibility than the loss of the man specifically. She felt instead a clean, cool sense of readiness, like a building that has been evacuated before demolition. Serena stood after Damien and raised her glass and said things about love and partnership and the people who held you when you didn't know you needed holding, and she looked at the table with those warm, attending eyes that had been Mara's window into what she'd believed was a genuine friendship. And Mara met her gaze when it moved to her and smiled, and it was a real smile. Not warm exactly, but real. The toast ended, the dessert came. She left at 10. She slept well. The morning of the wedding had the quality of light specific to late November in the city, flat and white and somehow both bright and dim, the kind of light that came from total overcast, that cast no shadows and made distances hard to read. She woke at 5:30 and lay still for a few minutes, listening to the sound of the building, the low vibration of the radiator, the elevator cable somewhere in the shaft, the distant early morning street below. Then she got up and made proper coffee, the kind with actual beans and actual time, and drank it standing at the window looking at the flat white sky. She had her dress in a garment bag on the back of her bedroom door. Dusty rose, floor length, an unusual cut that the designer had intended as romantic, and that Mara had looked at in the fitting room mirror and thought, this is not what I would have chosen. She had bought it anyway, which had seemed at the time like a minor sacrifice and now seemed like something else. A costume. A useful one. The bridal suite at the Whitmore Hotel was available from 8 a.m. for the wedding party. Hair and makeup were scheduled in shifts, with Dana Cho going first since she had the most involved look. Mara arrived at 8:15 and settled into the arrangement with the ease she'd been cultivating for months, engaged, pleasantly warm, without the performance that would draw attention. She talked to the makeup artist about a face serum she'd been using. She talked to Haley about Haley's flight back to Portland on Sunday. She ate a croissant from the catering spread and drank a glass of the water that was inexplicably always better in hotel rooms than at home, and she watched Dana Cho sit in the makeup chair and speak carefully in the low, careful voice of someone managing a significant throat issue. Dana's voice was going. She could hear it. That particular roughness that was not yet a full loss but was heading there. The sound of someone straining against the inflammation of what was clearly a developing laryngitis. Serena noticed it at 9:30. She came to Dana's chair under the guise of checking on her hair and took Dana's hands in both of hers and said in her concerned voice, the real one, Mara had always thought, or close to it, "Honey, how's your throat?" Dana said with effortful clearness. "It's fine. And it's just a little. I'll be fine. You sound. Are you sure?" "It'll open up," Dana said. "I've got hot water with honey. I've got the spray. I'll be fine by the ceremony." Serena looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of someone calculating and caring at the same time, and then said, "Of course you will," and squeezed her hands and moved away. Mara watched this from the couch near the window, where she was nominally reviewing something on her phone. At 10:45, Dana's voice was noticeably worse. She was speaking in a whisper when she had to speak, and she had stopped trying to project. The look on her face was that specific, miserable combination of physical discomfort and social obligation. The awareness that today was not her day to be sick, that this was Serena's day, that her own body was creating a problem at the worst possible time. Serena waited until 11 to address it. She brought Donna into the smaller bathroom off the suite. Mara watched them go and was in there with her for perhaps 12 minutes. When they came out, Serena's expression was an exquisitely calibrated blend of sympathy and crisis management. Dana looked like someone who had been crying very quietly and was managing it well. Serena turned to the room and said, in the particular tone of a person turning a situation with grace, "Dana is going to save her voice for the ceremony itself. So she's asked me to find a backup for the speech just in case. It's already written. She has it on a card." She paused and let her eyes move naturally to Mara. "Mara, would you be all right reading it if we need you to? I don't want to put you on the spot, but you're the most comfortable public speaker on the team." Mara looked up from her phone. She felt the room orient toward her. Haley, Camille, the makeup artist who had paused her work, Dana in the doorway with red-rimmed eyes. "Of course," she said. "Whatever Dana needs." Dana mouthed, "Thank you." It was genuine. Mara nodded at her with what she hoped was warmth that also communicated everything is fine, which in the context of Dana's situation it was, because the things that were about to happen at that altar were not things Dana had anything to do with. Serena produced the index card at 2 p.m., 2 hours before the ceremony. She pressed it into Mara's hand with a brief smile and said, "You're saving us," and moved on. And Mara turned the card over and read what was on it. It was her speech, every word of it. She read it through once, standing near the window with the flat white November light coming through the glass, and she felt something she had not expected to feel, which was a kind of grief. Not for herself, she understood, but for the speech itself, or for the person who had written it, who had meant every word and had not yet known what she was going to learn. She felt the grief for perhaps 4 seconds, standing at the window with the index card in her hand, and then she put it away. She had not needed the card anyway. She knew every word. The Whitmore Hotel ballroom in November had the smell of fresh flowers and catered food and the particular warm-cold air of a space that had been heavily climate-controlled to accommodate a specific number of bodies in formal dress. Gardenias, she noticed. Large arrangements of them at the end of every row, which had not been what the event coordinator had discussed, which meant the florist had substituted and no one had corrected it or no one had noticed. The gardenia smell was heavy and sweet in a way that verged on medicinal. She took her position at 6 feet to the left of where Serena would stand. The ballroom had 240 guests, arranged on both sides of the aisle, and she cataloged them in the 20 minutes before the ceremony began, the way she cataloged a new data set, not looking for anything specific, just taking inventory, building the map. Damien's father, Robert Holt, in the front left pew, with the upright posture of someone who had been handsome in his youth and now wore it as a kind of dignity. The 2 investors she'd met at the engagement party, Harmon Lee and a woman named Patrice Windle, were in the 3rd row right. Bernard Chu, the family attorney, was at the end of a row toward the back, which she noted as a specific kind of strategic placement. close to an exit, able to read the room from a distance. Priya Anand was not in the room, which she had not expected her to be. The music changed and the processional began, and she walked up the aisle with her shoulders level and her face composed, and her hands holding a small cluster of ivory ranunculus that matched the arrangements on the rows. And she took her position and stood. She watched the ceremony from that position. Damien stood at the altar in a charcoal suit that was impeccably cut, and wore the expression of a man performing an emotion he had verified was real before arriving. He looked at Serena as she walked in with the absolute focus of someone not allowing their eyes to travel anywhere else, which was, she noted, a specific kind of discipline. The vows were standard, officiant written with personal additions that were competent and had the particular warmth of things that had been workshopped over several evenings. She stood with her flowers and her face and thought about nothing in particular. The room was warm. The gardenias were overpowering. The groom had his eyes forward. Then the ceremony portion ended, and after the brief recessional movement and the repositioning for the reception program, there was the moment she had been waiting for, the shift from ceremony to celebration, the moment when the DJ lowered the music and the event coordinator gestured to the wedding party and said in a quiet aside that the toasts were beginning. Dana Cho found her immediately. Her voice was gone almost entirely now. She could manage a whisper and not much more. She pressed Mara's arm and whispered, "I'm so sorry," with a miserable sincerity that Mara responded to with a hand squeeze and a reassuring look that was also genuine, because Dana's misery was real and was not the relevant thing about this moment. The event coordinator offered a microphone. Mara took it. She had not looked at the index card. She didn't need to. She stood at the microphone with the microphone in one hand and the untouched card in her other hand. As in the dusty rose dress under the warm light of the Whitmore Hotel ballroom, with 240 faces turned toward her, and she looked at the room for a moment. Then she began. "I've been sitting with this speech for a long time," she said. Her voice was even, not performing evenness, but genuinely level, the voice of someone who has taken a great deal of time to arrive at a prepared place. "That's the first thing I want to say. The things in it are things I've carried carefully. Yeah, because they matter." She was not reading from the index card. She saw Serena at the head table register this. The expression was nearly imperceptible. A micro-compression at the corners of the eyes. A very small stillness. Damien beside her was watching Mara with the careful, neutral attention of a person who has not yet identified the nature of the thing he is watching. "The first story," Mara said, "is about a parking garage at 2 a.m. She told it. Oh, she told it exactly as she had written it. The specificity of the fluorescent light in the Alder and Finch parking structure, the quality of the concrete floor, the specific phrase the man in the story had not said, which was anything, because he had simply sat down. She told it with the precision of a woman who had been a technical writer before she became a financial forensic analyst, someone who understood that specificity was the difference between a story and an anecdote. She did not name the man. She did not need to. Everyone at the table that mattered understood, within approximately 30 seconds, whose parking garage this was and who had been sitting in it. She watched the room as she spoke. She watched Robert Holt's face, in the front row, shift from the mild engaged attention of a parent listening to a wedding toast to something more alert and more still. She watched Harmon Lee, in the third row, exchange a brief glance with Patrice Windle that was not the glance of people sharing a sentiment, but the glance of people cross-referencing a perception. She watched Bernard Chu, in the back row near the exit, put down his champagne glass. She did not watch Damien. She told the second story, the Coast Trip. The hotel with the peeling wallpaper in a town she named specifically, Graywell, a town of 400 people and 2 restaurants on the northern coast. Not a place you went to unless you had a reason. She described the wallpaper pattern because she remembered it. Small blue herons, repeated, the color faded to a grayish periwinkle. She described how they had laughed at it, and how the laughter had been the specific kind that happens when you are with someone in a situation that is a little bit absurd, and you are not embarrassed by the absurdity. She described the restaurant where they'd eaten both evenings because there were only 2, and they'd felt against all reason, like regulars by the second night. The room was very quiet, not the quiet of sentimentality. She told the third story, the Sunday in February. She had wondered in the months of preparation whether to include this one. It was the most intimate of the three, the most specifically domestic. She had decided to include it because it was the truest. It was the story about a thing so small and so genuine that it was impossible to have invented. A documentary series about migratory birds, 4 hours on a couch, a specific kind of stillness. There is a kind of person, she said, still not reading from the card, who can give you exactly what you need without knowing that's what they're doing. And the specific and particular story of how I came to understand that, how I came to understand this person, is what I've been asked to share today. She paused. She let the pause be exactly as long as it needed to be. I've been asked to share it at this wedding, she said, because it's a love story. And it is. She looked for the first time since she'd begun speaking at Damien Holt. He was looking back at her. His face had the color and texture of someone who has been very carefully managing a room and has suddenly understood that the room is not where he thought it was. Serena beside him was very still. "Congratulations," Mara said. She said it to the room, which was her right as the person holding the microphone, and the room received it in the silence that had replaced the previous silence, a harder, stranger silence. Charged with the specific electricity of 240 people, sitting with what they had just understood but had not yet spoken. She handed the microphone back to the event coordinator. She returned to her position at the wedding party table. She drank her water, which was cold and very clear. And she looked at the table surface, which was white cloth with a small scatter of eucalyptus leaves as decoration, and she thought about nothing at all for perhaps 30 seconds. The reception went on. This was the thing about catastrophes contained within social structures. The structure continued. The DJ resumed. The catering staff moved between tables with the focused efficiency of people who had seen many wedding receptions and had developed a specific immunity to their emotional weather. People ate their first courses and talked to each other, and if the conversations at certain tables were not the conversations that had been expected, they were still conversations. Still the form of a wedding reception. She ate her dinner. Haley beside her was silent for the first 20 minutes in the specific silence of someone who has processed a thing and does not yet know how to address it. Then, she said quietly, "That was your speech." "Yes," Mara said. Haley looked at her for a moment. "How long have you known?" "Long enough," Mara said. Haley picked up her fork, said nothing else. Camille, on the other side, was talking across her to the groomsmen on Camille's right about the centerpiece flowers, which was either a performance of normalcy or a genuine capacity to move on quickly, and Mara found she didn't need to determine which. She watched, from her peripheral vision, the movement of people in the room. Robert Holt had left his front row table 20 minutes after the speech and had not returned. She had seen him in brief conversation with Bernard Chu near the exit at the back. A conversation that had the body language of two people who are speaking quickly and precisely, and then they had both disappeared toward what she assumed was the lobby. Harmon Lee and Patrice Windle had left before the first course was served. The room itself did not know entirely what had happened. 240 people were in various stages of understanding. Some had known, or suspected, something about Mara and Damien's history and had connected the speech immediately. And some had been present only for the social surface of it, and had registered something wrong without naming it. Some were entirely unconcerned and were eating their soup, but a certain critical mass of people, the important ones, the ones who held the financial and legal and social infrastructure of Damien Holt's world, had heard what they'd heard and were already, some of them, making calls. She was not in a hurry. She had made her own call 3 weeks ago. A brief, off-the-record conversation with a financial journalist named Suki Watanabe, who covered the investment sector for a publication that Damien's investor community read. She had not given Suki specific information, not the SEC filing, not the case details, nothing that would interfere with the legal process. She had given her a tip, a suggestion that Holt Meridian's fund structure was worth examining carefully, particularly the cross-jurisdictional holding companies. She had said, "I think you'll find some interesting structural questions." And Suki had said in the specific, careful voice of a journalist who has heard this before but is not dismissing it, "Can I come back to you?" Mara had said yes. She expected Suki's call in the next week, possibly sooner given what was going to circulate from this room. At 9 p.m., 2.5 hours into the reception, Serena found her. It happened in the way these things happened in social spaces that were too public for a real confrontation. Serena materialized at her side during a moment when she was standing slightly apart from the group near the bar, refilling a water glass, and stood close enough for a private conversation, but at an angle that would look, from a distance, like two women at a wedding chatting. Serena's face was perfect. This was a credit to her, in a cold way. The expression she wore was the one she wore in situations that required performance. Warm surface, everything managed. Only her eyes were slightly different, a focused brightness that was not warmth. That was Dana's speech, Serena said. Very quiet, very even. I was given an index card with a speech on it, Mara said. I delivered it. You know what was on that card? Mara looked at her. I delivered what was on the card. A pause. Serena's jaw moved fractionally. Oh, why would you? I was trying to help, Mara said. You asked me to be your backup speaker. Dana lost her voice. I stepped in. She paused. It was a beautiful speech. Something moved across Serena's face that was not, for once, managed. It was something rawer. Not quite rage, not quite grief, but some compressed combination that the performed warmth could not fully contain. It passed in less than 2 seconds. I see, Serena said. Congratulations, Serena, Mara said. She said it with genuine absence of irony, which was harder than irony would have been, and more devastating. I mean that. Serena looked at her for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked back toward the head table, where her new husband was sitting with the careful posture of a man who had been very quiet for 2 hours. Mara finished her water. She retrieved her coat from the coat check at 10 p.m., before the cake cutting. She nodded to Dana Cho on her way out. Donna said, who had been sitting with her herbal tea all evening in the muted misery of her lost voice, gave her a look that she couldn't entirely read, and she nodded back. The lobby of the Whitmore Hotel had the particular quiet of a space between events. The ambient hum of HVAC, the front desk staff in their practiced attentiveness, the soft click of the revolving door. She walked through it without hurrying. Outside, the city was doing what it did in late November. Cold air with a faint trace of the rain that had fallen that morning, the streetlights making small halos in the damp, the particular smell of the city at night, which was exhaust and concrete, and the vague sweetness of the late-closing restaurants still carrying their cooking smells onto the sidewalk. She stood on the curb and waited for her car. Her phone showed 2 missed calls. Owen Park, who she would call on Monday as agreed, and Suki Watanabe, whose number she had not expected to see for another week. Suki had left a message. The message said, Mara, I've been getting some interesting information this evening from sources at a certain investor community event. I think it might be time for that follow-up conversation. Call me when you can. She stood on the wet sidewalk in the flat November cold and looked at the message for a moment. Then she put her phone back in her bag. Her car arrived. A hired car, dark gray, to warm interior, the driver with the deliberate quiet of someone who understood his job. She got in and gave her address and leaned back against the seat and looked out the window at the city going past. The lit windows of apartments stacked in their grids, the movement of other cars, the brief, bright frame of a bodega on a corner, a man walking a small white dog in a yellow raincoat. The city doing all the things it did regardless of what had happened and was happening and would continue to happen within it. She thought about the Hartfield Holdings documents, filed and sealed in Owen Park's office. She thought about Suki Watanabe's voicemail. She thought about Robert Holt and Bernard Chu in conversation near the ballroom exit. She thought about a parking garage at 2 a.m. and a man who had sat down on concrete without asking a question. Well, then she stopped thinking about that. She pulled out her phone and called Suki Watanabe. It's Mara Cole, she said. I got your message.